James Cooper had finally achieved his dream of rural living after 15 grueling years climbing the corporate ladder at Westfield Financial. Each morning spent in fluorescent-lit meeting rooms and each evening stuck in gridlock traffic had fueled his growing desire for open spaces and quiet solitude. When the opportunity arose to take an early retirement package at 45, he didn't hesitate. Within 3 months, he had sold his cookie-cutter suburban home in Oak Ridge Heights and purchased a modest 5-acre property on the outskirts of Riverdale County. The small farmhouse wasn't much to look at initially, peeling paint, a sagging porch, and outdated everything. But James saw potential where others saw problems. The sturdy red barn, though weathered, had good bones and a new metal roof. And the rolling pasture, dotted with wildflowers and bordered by ancient oak trees, was exactly the peaceful setting he had envisioned during all those years trapped in his downtown cubicle. On his first morning waking up at Wildflower Farm, a name he'd chosen with equal parts irony and hope, James stood on his creaky porch, coffee mug in hand, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The air smelled of grass and earth instead of exhaust and concrete. Birdsong replaced car horns, and most importantly, there wasn't a neighborhood covenant or busybody committee member in sight. No more letters about his grass being half an inch too tall or fines for leaving his garbage can at the curb past 7 p.m. This land was his and his alone. Or so he thought. What James didn't realize, what his real estate agent had conveniently failed to mention, was that his property technically bordered the edge of the Meadow Creek Estate's HOA territory. The luxury development had sprung up 3 years earlier on what used to be farmland, bringing with it manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and a residents' association with more rules than the tax code. According to county records, James' property was exempt from the HOA's jurisdiction, a grandfathered exception that the developer had been forced to accept when the original owner refused to sell. But that technicality hadn't stopped Melissa Winters, Meadow Creek's most zealous board member, from taking special interest in what she repeatedly called that eyesore of a farm during monthly HOA meetings. From her expansive back deck, positioned on the lot furthest up the hill to maximize what the developer had marketed as pastoral views, Melissa could see the edge of James' property. What had been advertised as a charming glimpse of rural Americana was, in her opinion, an affront to proper community standards. The barn needed painting, the fence posts weren't uniform. And was that actually a compost heap visible from her outdoor entertainment area? It's bringing down property values, she insisted to anyone who would listen, citing no evidence beyond her own certainty. Someone needs to do something about it. James remained blissfully unaware of the gathering storm. He spent his days restoring the farmhouse room by room, clearing overgrown paths through his small woodland area, and making plans for a vegetable garden come spring. For the first time in decades, he fell asleep without setting an alarm and woke with the sun, his schedule dictated by nothing but his own whims and the weather. That sense of freedom was about to be challenged in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The pride of James's small farmstead wasn't the newly renovated kitchen or the antique tractor he'd restored. It was Daisy, a 10-year-old rescue donkey with soft gray fur, soulful brown eyes, and a personality as big as her ears. She came into his life 3 months after he moved to Wildflower Farm when a local animal rescue posted an urgent appeal on social media. "This sweet Jenny needs a forever home," the post had read. "Good with other animals but wary of strangers. Previous owners surrendered her after multiple incidents with trespassers." Something about those words and the accompanying photo of a donkey with wary eyes and a hesitant stance spoke to James. Perhaps he recognized a kindred spirit, another soul seeking sanctuary from a world that had been unkind. Whatever the reason, James found himself driving to Hopeful Heart's animal rescue the very next morning. "I should warn you," the rescue director, Ellen, told him as they approached Daisy's enclosure. "She has some trust issues. The family that surrendered her lived on a busy road, and they had problems with people stopping to feed or pet her without permission." She started getting defensive, nothing extreme, just warning nips and the occasional well-placed kick when someone ignored her signals. James understood immediately. "People need to respect boundaries," he said simply. Ellen smiled, relieved by his response. "Exactly. Donkeys aren't like horses. They don't flee from perceived threats, they stay and defend. Daisy's not aggressive. She's protective. She just needs someone who understands that and gives her space to feel secure." Their introduction was conducted with slow, deliberate movements. James sat quietly in a corner of her paddock, speaking in soft tones and offering no demands. On the third visit, Daisy approached on her own, snuffling his outstretched palm before accepting a gentle scratch behind her ears. By the 5th visit, the rescue staff were amazed at the transformation. "It's like she was waiting for you," Ellen remarked as Daisy followed James around the enclosure like an oversized dog. Moving Daisy to Wildflower Farm presented its own challenges. Though friendly with James, she remained deeply suspicious of strangers. The transport volunteers learned this the hard way when one made the mistake of entering her trailer without introduction. No one was injured, but the volunteer's hat would never be the same. Over the weeks that followed, James and Daisy developed a routine. Mornings began with fresh hay and a thorough brushing, which Daisy leaned into with obvious pleasure. Afternoons often found them walking the property's perimeter, Daisy's hooves creating a steady rhythm beside James's boots. In the evenings, she would stand at the fence line, ears perked forward, waiting for James to bring a carrot and tell her about his day. With patience and gentle care, James earned Daisy's complete trust. She mellowed enough to tolerate the occasional visitor, provided they were properly introduced and respected her space. But she remained wary of unfamiliar faces, especially those who approached suddenly or made loud noises. In fact, James was careful to explain to the rare visitors he allowed near her enclosure. "Always let her see you coming," he would instruct, demonstrating the proper approach. "No sudden movements, no loud voices, and never, ever enter her space without me present." Most visitors heeded his warnings. After all, even the gentlest donkey was still a powerful animal weighing over 500 pounds, with teeth designed for tearing tough vegetation and hooves that could crack walnuts or bones with equal ease. What James didn't know was that his most problematic neighbor was about to ignore every one of those carefully explained rules. Melissa Winters hadn't always been the neighborhood tyrant of Meadow Creek Estates. 5 years ago, she'd been just another middle manager at a regional insurance company, dutiful but unremarkable. Then came her election to the HOA board, and with it, a taste of power that transformed her. What began as enthusiastic volunteerism quickly morphed into something more obsessive. Fellow residents started referring to her as the HOA Karen behind her back, a nickname she would have despised had she known about it. Her own home was a testament to her dedication or fixation, depending on who you asked. The lawn was mowed in perfect diagonal stripes every Thursday afternoon. The exterior paint was refreshed annually, never deviating from the approved meadow sage palette. Holiday decorations appeared and disappeared precisely on the dates specified in Section 7.3 of the Community Guidelines. In Melissa's world, rules weren't just important. They were the very framework of civilization. The arrival of a scruffy ex-corporate type with his weathered barn and untamed landscape had been an immediate affront to her sensibilities. When she learned that a technicality exempted his property from HOA oversight, she took it as a personal challenge, rather than a legal limitation. It began with what Melissa considered friendly outreach. A 4-page letter detailing the aesthetic standards of Meadow Creek Estates, complete with highlighted sections she thought might be of particular interest to her new neighbor. She hand-delivered it to James' mailbox, scanning a moment to survey his property with pursed lips before driving away in her immaculately maintained white Lexus SUV. James' polite but firm response, a brief note explaining that his property wasn't part of the HOA and thanking her for her concern, only served to intensify Melissa's mission. Over the following weeks, the correspondence became increasingly one-sided and hostile. "Your composting area is an eyesore and likely a health hazard," read one letter, accompanied by a blurry long-distance photo that could have been anything. "Natural prairie grasses harbor rodents and present a fire risk," declared another, conveniently ignoring that the County Agricultural Extension Office actively encouraged such plantings for ecological benefits. When James stopped responding altogether, Melissa escalated her campaign. Residents of Meadow Creek began to notice her silver Lexus creeping slowly past James' property at odd hours. Some spotted her standing at the edge of his land, smartphone held high as she documented perceived violations with the intensity of an investigative journalist on a stakeout. "It's getting a bit weird," commented Dave Harmon, Melissa's next-door neighbor, after witnessing her third drive-by of the day. "I mean, the guy's place looks fine from what I can see. Rustic, sure, but that's kind of the charm of living near the countryside, isn't it?" But Melissa was beyond reason. Each improvement James made to his property, the freshly painted trim on the farmhouse, the neat stack of firewood, the wildflower meadow bursting with color, she interpreted as a deliberate provocation. In her mind, he wasn't simply living his life. He was defying her authority. The situation reached a breaking point at the May HOA meeting. As board secretary delivered his report on community finances, Melissa suddenly stood, interrupting him mid-sentence. "I'd like to discuss a pressing community concern," she announced, pulling out her tablet and connecting it to the meeting room projector without waiting for acknowledgement from the board president. The screen filled with a slideshow titled "Property Value Threats: The Cooper Problem." For the next 15 minutes, Melissa clicked through dozens of photos of James' property, each accompanied by circles and arrows highlighting supposed infractions. "This is a disgrace to our community aesthetic," she declared to the increasingly uncomfortable audience. "If we allow this kind of rural decay to exist on our borders, what message does that send about Meadow Creek Estates?" As the presentation concluded, several residents exchanged glances, clearly embarrassed by the display. The board president cleared his throat. Thank you, Melissa, for your thoroughness. However, as we discussed previously, Mr. Cooper's property isn't actually under our jurisdiction, so I'm not sure what action you're proposing. Melissa's smile tightened as she gathered her materials. Don't worry, she replied, her voice eerily calm. I'll handle the situation personally. No one in the room realized just how literally she meant those words. The third Saturday in May dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that reminded James why he left city life behind. After a leisurely breakfast on his newly restored porch, he checked his to-do list and sighed. The vegetable garden was coming along nicely, but he'd run out of the specialized soil amendments his tomatoes needed. A trip to the garden center in town was unavoidable. I'll only be gone a couple of hours, he told Daisy as he filled her water trough and checked that her feed bin was amply stocked. The donkey watched him with her intelligent eyes, braying softly as if in acknowledgement. You be good while I'm gone. James double-checked the barn door latch and the gate to Daisy's outdoor enclosure before climbing into his mud-spattered pickup truck. The property wasn't fully fenced yet, another project on his ever-growing list, but Daisy had shown no inclination to wander. She was happiest in her familiar territory, where she felt secure. What James couldn't have known was that Melissa Winters had been monitoring his comings and goings for weeks, noting patterns and planning her reconnaissance mission with military precision. She'd observed that Saturday mornings often meant a trip to town, and today, watching from her strategic position at the corner where Meadow Creek Drive met the county road, she saw her opportunity unfold. The moment James' truck disappeared around the bend, Melissa checked her reflection in her visor mirror, adjusting her designer sunglasses and tucking a stray blonde hair into her immaculate bob. This wasn't just another drive by documentation. Today, she would gather the evidence needed to force action, even if traditional HOA channels had proven frustratingly limited. 10 minutes later, her white Lexus SUV rolled to a stop not at the edge of James' property where she usually parked, but directly in front of it, partially concealed by a stand of young maple trees. Melissa stepped out, smartphone in one hand and a small digital camera with zoom lens in the other. Today's mission required professional-grade documentation. This is for the good of the community, she reminded herself, straightening her linen blazer as she marched purposefully up the gravel drive. She'd rehearsed her explanation if caught. She was simply a concerned neighbor, checking if everything was all right after noticing suspicious activity. It wasn't technically a lie. She did indeed find James' entire existence suspicious. The farmhouse looked disappointingly presentable in the morning light, its fresh paint and rebuilt porch undermining her narrative of neglect. Undeterred, Melissa headed for the large red barn. That's where the real evidence would be. Surely no one actually living in Riverdale County kept livestock properly these days. Finding the main door secured with what appeared to be a simple sliding latch, she hesitated only briefly. If you really cared about security, you have a proper lock, she reasoned, pushing aside the nagging awareness that she was crossing a significant legal and ethical boundary. The heavy wooden door slid open with a protesting creak. Melissa stepped inside, smartphone already raised to capture the anticipated squalor. The bright May sunshine created dramatic shafts of light through the high windows, temporarily blinding her as her eyes adjusted to the barn's interior. What she saw defied her expectations entirely. Instead of neglect and filth, the barn was meticulously organized. Fresh straw covered the floor in tidy layers. Tools hung in orderly rows on the far wall. The air smelled of clean hay and subtle lavender, likely from the dried bundles hanging from the rafters. It was, if Melissa were honest with herself, which she rarely was these days, far cleaner than her own garage. Her momentary confusion was interrupted by a shuffling sound from the back of the barn. Turning, Melissa saw what appeared to be a large gray donkey in a spacious stall, its ears suddenly erect, dark eyes fixed directly on her. The animal had been peacefully munching hay before sensing the intrusion and was now completely still, unnervingly focused on the stranger who had entered its domain without introduction or invitation. Any reasonable person might have recognized this as a moment to retreat. Melissa Winters was no longer a reasonable person. In the tense silence of the barn, Daisy gave Melissa her first warning. The donkey's ears, previously perked in curiosity, flattened against her head, a clear signal of distress to anyone familiar with equine body language. Her nostrils flared, and she pawed once at the straw-covered floor of her stall. Melissa noticed none of these warning signs. Instead, her mind was rapidly recalculating. Without evidence of neglect or unsafe conditions, her planned exposure was falling apart. But then inspiration struck, a new angle for her campaign. Exotic animals, she murmured to herself, tapping at her phone screen to open the camera app. Unregulated livestock in a residential adjacent property. That's even better. She stepped closer to Daisy's stall, squinting at the informational sheet James had posted nearby that detailed proper donkey care. According to county zoning regulations she studied in preparation for this visit, Livestock was technically permitted on properties over 2 acres, but that inconvenient fact could be glossed over in her presentation. What Melissa needed now was visual impact, something to elicit gasps at the next HOA meeting. A selfie with the dirty farm animal would be perfect. She could already envision the shocked faces of her neighbors as she showed photographic proof of how close this dangerous beast was to their manicured community. Daisy gave her second warning, a low, rumbling bray that rose in pitch and volume. She shuffled backward in her stall, creating distance between herself and the stranger. Again, these clear signals of distress went unheeded. "Look at the camera, you smelly thing," Melissa muttered, raising her phone high for the perfect angle that would capture both her carefully concerned expression and the donkey behind her. Unsatisfied with the composition, she took another step closer, reaching her arm over the stall door to get a better angle. Daisy's third warning was the most explicit yet. She bared her teeth, large, yellowed incisors designed for tearing tough vegetation, and let out a sharp, piercing bray that echoed off the barn walls. Her entire body tensed, muscles coiled beneath her gray coat. "Be quiet, you stupid animal," Melissa hissed, leaning even farther over the stall door. Her manicured hand, complete with freshly painted summer blush nails, invaded Daisy's carefully established safe space. "I just need one good picture." What happened next occurred in a blur of movement and sound. Daisy, having given all the warnings she reasonably could to the human invading her territory, switched from flight to fight. With surprising speed for an animal her size, she lunged forward, teeth bared. Melissa had just enough time to see the flash of those large teeth before they clamped down on her outstretched forearm. Simultaneously, Daisy spun slightly in her stall, powerful hind legs connecting solidly with the stall door right beneath where Melissa was leaning. The impact set Melissa's phone flying in one direction while she stumbled backward in another. The smartphone clattered across the barn floor, its screen shattering on impact. Melissa landed hard on her tailbone, her designer blazer now smeared with barn dust and her arm throbbing with sharp, hot pain where Daisy's teeth had made contact. For one stunned moment, Melissa sat in shocked silence, her brain struggling to process what had just happened. Then the pain fully registered and her outrage followed in its wake. "You vicious beast!" she shrieked, her voice high and tight with pain and humiliation. She scrambled to her feet, clutching her injured arm against her chest. The bite hadn't broken the skin, thanks to her blazer's thick material, but it would leave an impressive bruise, physical evidence of her martyrdom in the cause of neighborhood standards. Daisy, having made her point, retreated to the back of her stall, her message clearly delivered. Boundaries matter. Melissa's screams continued to echo through the barn as she stumbled toward the exit, a stream of threats and accusations flowing unchecked. Dangerous animal. Attack. Lawsuit. Each exclamation bounced off the wooden walls, creating a cacophony that sent a nearby family of barn swallows fluttering from their nest in alarm. In her haste and distress, Melissa failed to notice two critical details. The small security camera mounted discreetly in the corner of the barn, its red light blinking steadily, and the sound of a truck engine growing louder in the distance. James had just loaded the last bag of specialized soil amendments into his truck when his phone buzzed with a security alert. The barn motion sensor had been triggered. Tapping the notification, he watched with growing alarm as the live stream showed a woman in a blazer entering his barn without permission. James immediately abandoned his shopping cart and headed for the checkout, his leisurely Saturday errand now an urgent dash home. He pulled into his driveway 20 minutes later to find a scene he hadn't anticipated. A Riverdale County Sheriff's Department cruiser parked alongside a white Lexus SUV. On his porch stood a uniformed officer, notebook in hand, listening to a gesticulating woman whose designer outfit was now smudged with barn dust. Even from a distance, James could see she was cradling her right arm against her chest, her face contorted with righteous indignation. "That's him," Melissa exclaimed as James approached. "That's the owner of the dangerous animal that attacked me." Deputy Mark Rodriguez, a veteran officer with 20 years' experience in navigating the delicate balance of rural property disputes, nodded politely but reserved judgment. "Mr. Cooper, I'm responding to a report of an animal attack on your property." "She was trespassing in my barn," James replied calmly, though his heart was racing. His first concern was for Daisy, who, from the sounds of contented munching coming from the barn, appeared unharmed by the encounter. Melissa's voice rose an octave. "That's completely irrelevant. Your vicious donkey attacked me without provocation. I was simply conducting a wellness check as a concerned neighbor when that beast lunged at me." She thrust her arm forward dramatically. "Look at this bruise forming. I could have been killed." Deputy Rodriguez maintained his professional demeanor. "Ma'am, you mentioned earlier you were taking photos. For documentation purposes only," Melissa insisted. "This property is a menace to our community standards." James took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Deputy, I have security cameras in the barn for Daisy's protection." Perhaps the footage would clarify what happened. Melissa's smug expression faltered slightly. Cameras? I didn't see any cameras. That's generally the point of security cameras, ma'am, Deputy Rodriguez noted dryly. Mr. Cooper, I'd be interested in viewing that footage if it's available. The three moved to James' porch where he pulled up the security feed on his tablet. The high-definition video told a story that contradicted Melissa's version in every particular, from her deliberate trespassing to her ignoring Daisy's increasingly obvious warnings to her explicit attempt to provoke the animal for a photo opportunity. As the footage concluded, an uncomfortable silence fell over the porch. Deputy Rodriguez cleared his throat and turned to Melissa. Ms. Winters, based on this evidence, I'll be issuing you a citation for criminal trespassing and animal harassment. You're lucky Mr. Cooper's donkey showed remarkable restraint, or your injuries could have been much more severe. The color drained from Melissa's face. This is outrageous. I'm the victim here. The law is quite clear, the deputy continued, writing in his citation book. You've entered private property without permission and provoked a contained animal after multiple warnings. Mr. Cooper would be well within his rights to pursue additional civil charges. As the implications sank in, Melissa's expression shifted from outrage to calculation. I was acting in my capacity as an HOA board member, she attempted, grasping for authority. Our covenants clearly state. Your HOA has no jurisdiction over my property, James interrupted firmly. That's been established multiple times, as you well know. The final nail in Melissa's crusade came 2 weeks later at an emergency HOA meeting called specifically to address recent incidents. James had forwarded the security footage to the board president, along with copies of the police report and a letter from his attorney outlining the potential liability the HOA faced if they continued to endorse Melissa's harassment. The vote was unanimous. Melissa Winters was removed from her position, effective immediately, and the board issued a formal acknowledgement that James Cooper's property lay outside their jurisdiction, along with an apology for the unfortunate misunderstanding. As for Daisy, she received extra carrot treats that week and a new, more secure barn door with a proper lock, not to protect others from her, but to protect her from unwanted visitors who hadn't learned to respect boundaries. And if James noticed that drivers from Meadow Creek Estates now slowed appreciatively when passing his blooming wildflower meadow instead of scowling at his rural decay, he simply tipped his hat and smiled, content in the knowledge that sometimes justice comes with a bray and a well-placed hoof.